Hi, welcome to this podcast on the systems lifecycle. At this point, we're now going to have a quick look at the documentation that you need to know about for the systems lifecycle. If you notice, we've got the various phases of the systems lifecycle, and we can see where various documentation comes into play. In the maintenance phase, we will need the user documentation and the technical documentation to be given out. In the evaluation phase, we will be producing testing documentation. The design phase will produce the design specification and program specification, whereas the analysis phase will produce the requirement specification, which is documentation as well. Now, we've already talked about the analysis and requirements in that phase, and we've already talked about the design specification in the design phase. So, equally, the testing documentation is just documentation that details all of the testing that takes place. The documentation that I want us to look at the moment is these two sets here, and these are generally what you'll be asked on. If you're asked a question on these ones, they might come up within a question about analysis or design, whereas these ones might come up and say, what two types of documentation would you have at the end? Alright, so if you have a quick look at these. Documentation. So we've already come across, as I said, the requirements, the design specification and program specification. Documentation of the system consists of all the text and graphics that explain how the system is to be or was produced and how it should be used and how it should be maintained. There are two main types of documentation that are pulled together at the end. So this is all the documentation we have at the end. The technical documentation and the user documentation. So, what's in the technical documentation is a question that's often asked. So, it's a detailing of how the system works, includes program specifications, as we mentioned before, the program specification was there, and details of the hardware configurations. Data flow diagrams showing flow of data through the system, system flow charts showing how parts of the system interrelate, flow charts showing the algorithms, entity relationship diagrams showing how data tables relate to each other. So, a lot of the stuff that we've done in the design phase will come in the technical documentation and go in there. This can then be used to aid a technician in maintaining or updating a system. It is not intended to be accessible by the user. It is built as the system progresses. It is started in the design stage but will be updated as the system progresses and will grow as the solution grows and change if the solution changes. So we get the design stage, we will put that as part of our documentation, but if anything changes as we go along, we will add and alter that documentation. So at the end, we've got a fully detailed technical document that can be used to help maintain the system. So the other type we've got is user documentation, and this is going to be used by the person who uses the system, obviously. So this includes how to install the system onto specific hardware, or it might include the required hardware specs. Generally, that will count for 1 mark if you get a question on this. It's going to have the methods of input of data, examples of valid input, examples of output screen, error messages and what to do when they appear, or troubleshooting help, frequently asked questions, could have help available, so hotlines, email addresses, websites, other resources, etc., file searching and maintenance of files, backing up and archiving if that needs to be done, glossary for terms that might be used in the system, and index and contents. Now those bottom two are quite weak, I think, when answering an exam question, so try and hit the other ones first if you can, but if you do run out of ideas, then obviously they can be put in. The user guide should reflect the requirement specification, as the requirement spec makes it clear what is required for the system. So the user guide should detail how to use the software to carry out these tasks. So how would you use the software to carry out the various tasks that are outlined in the requirements spec? What I would suggest you do is go and have a quick look, you might see on the internet, but go and have a look at some user documentation for a piece of software that you've got at home and see what's in it, and that might help you understand what would be contained in the user documentation.